Well, linguists tell us that in some cultures, they don't have a word for right and left. Instead, the description of where things are or how to orient is dependent on geographic features or on what cardinal direction you're facing. In other words, I'm not standing in front of you, but I'm standing eastward or mountainside, right? Or east riverside, depending on how far you want to orient. And the windows are not on your left or my right, but they are on the north riverside of the building, right? And you are on the west side, or if you want to go further, the seaside of the building there. It's a little bit difficult to kind of get your bearings that way. And even though the sea's miles away, that's just how you would talk. That's how you would communicate. And since we use right and left, we don't really need to think about it this way, but we can imagine that if we had to rely on this, we would need to pay attention to the world in a very different way, a much different way than we're used to, right? As I gesture to you with my south hand, right? I don't really know how that works. You know, you hope that if you need your south kidney to be operated on, that the doctor and the surgeon are in the right room to be on the same page as far as that goes, right? I heard a story about a researcher who spent some time among people who use cardinal directions to orient themselves. And she had spent some time in this community and trying to learn the language and especially their way of orienting. But she struggled for a good week or so, just struggled to communicate. But then one day, she said, she was just walking along, and all of a sudden, she described something like this window that she saw opening in her mind. And it had this bird's eye view of the landscape, and she just knew which way was which. Almost like if you look at your phone and you turn and it shows you the direction that you're turning. And she said that just opened up in her mind and she just got it. She just knew this new frame of reference. And it shows you that our brains can adjust to a number of different things, but sometimes we just need a reason to reorient, right? We need, especially when our communication is dependent on it. She had to learn a new direction to trust. Well, I'll have the new slide up. We have in our scripture today in Hebrews, we heard this picture of faith described. And I want to explore it. It's not just something that we have, but it's something that moves us, as we see in that first chapter of Hebrews 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It's a little bit of an obscure passage because it's not exactly a definition of faith, and I'm not sure that's what's being offered. It's more like encouragement that's being offered. But let's look at these words here. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. That word in Greek actually means it's the essence or reality of things hoped for. It's also used to describe a substance, something you would actually touch and hold. But faith isn't a substance, right? Time, just like time is not really a substance, and yet we're sure of it, right? We're sure that time goes by, time passes. Well, that's what this author is trying to say about faith. And that word conviction, well, that's used often as evidence, proof, especially in a judicial trial, right? So you're talking about some very real things that you can see, and yet it's talking about faith, this thing that we don't have or hold or see. And so we have this common assumption, I think, that faith means believing that something is true when evidence is not sufficient enough to establish certainty, right? So we can certainly see things and experience things to a certain point, but to get from here to here, there's that bridge that needs to be crossed by faith, right? I think that's often how we think of it. And I think that's helpful, but it's not really the whole picture of faith either. I'll give you an example. It's one thing to say that I believe that God exists, right? I can say that, but that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. That doesn't give you a whole lot of information. It doesn't do a lot, right? I want to know what that means for how your life is oriented. And think about the relationships you have, especially with the people that you are closest to. Imagine asking them, "Do you believe in me?" And they replied, "I believe that you exist." That'd be so unsatisfying, wouldn't it? That's so insufficient. We expect more information about the relationship, right? We want some context. I want to know that you have some expectation of my character and what I'm about. I want you to know that. And if you're not able to say that, well, I got to work on that relationship, right? Well, we experience faith as this animating force. It's not just something that fills in where knowledge ends. It's not just that bit of bridge to get from what we know to what we don't. Instead, faith is that substance that deepens a relationship. What does our faith do? What is the kind of world we hope for? Well, that should be evident in our actions. And Jesus is talking a little bit about this in a different way. We'll go to the next slide here. We have that passage in Luke where Jesus is telling his followers, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, we often see this, and I think about this as our heart tells us what we treasure, right? We hear a phrase often, "Listen to your heart," right? We might even tell others to do that. And while that is important, the assumption is that heart, if we listen to our heart will guide us to what we treasure in life. That could work that way. But what Jesus is telling his followers here is it looks like the treasure comes first. Now, whatever order he means, the helpful observation here is we are a people who treasure, right? We're people who find something or some things in life to treasure. And one thing that's worth noting here is that your treasure, your heart there, that word is plural in the text, in the Greek text there. So it turns our attention away from this individual exercise of trying to discern what do I treasure to more of a collective experience. As a community, as a body of believers, what do we treasure? And this is an interesting question, especially as we're in the ongoing process. We heard about our core values discernment process, that survey months ago. A couple months ago, we heard about that. Just want to keep that work up. It is still going. We are still talking about that and plan to get more information to you. But that discovering our core values, that's kind of getting to what we treasure as a community. And Jesus shows us what to treasure by showing who God is, right? That God is giving us the kingdom, Jesus says. Don't fear, little flock. God is giving you the kingdom. In this story, we get a picture of God, this generous God. We'll go to the next slide there. I think I have another slide. Yes, yeah. Jesus is telling us gives us this picture of these servants who are waiting for the master to come home. They're waiting for the one who will arrive so they can serve that person, right? But the surprise, right? And this is Jesus telling us who God is, this picture of God, is the one who they are waiting for to serve. That one is actually the one who serves them. And we see that in Jesus, that God is a generous God, who has come to serve us, showing us that unfolding love. God is generous towards us. And that love orients us to see treasures beyond what we experience in this world, beyond our own personal treasures. one of the famous stories of one of the saints of the church. We'll go to the next slide here. St. Lawrence lived in the 3rd century or so during a time of Roman persecution by the Emperor Valerian. And St. Ambrose tells this story about Lawrence, that in Rome, where Lawrence was, he was asked to bring forward all the treasures of the church, right? The empire, this local leader, wanted to confiscate those to try to disrupt and disband the church. Well, Lawrence asked for a couple days. And during that time, he distributed all the treasures of the church to the poor people in Rome. And when time came, a couple days later, to appear again before the Roman leader, Lawrence brought forward all the suffering, the widows, the poor, everyone. And he said to that Roman leader, these are the treasures of the church. And you see that the church is richer than your emperor. Well, he was killed for that, eventually, for that defiance. But you see here that Lawrence was oriented to a different set of what to treasure. And as we learn to trust God and take Jesus' teachings to heart, we learn to pay attention to the world in a different way. And our understanding of what treasure is reoriented. I'll end with this quote by Martin Luther describing this animating power of faith. Luther's talking about faith as this force, that's always at work, always bearing good fruit. And he's describing its function and value, and he talks about it here. Faith is this living, daring confidence in God's grace. So sure and certain that the believer would stake their life on it 1,000 times. I used to think this sounds intimidating, that my faith or my sense of trust needs to be sure, needs to be so certain. But I've learned that it's not really strengthened, this faith is not strengthened by my ability, but by the God in whom what little trust we have is placed. And that is how we navigate. One of the quotes that has kind of stayed with me in this work that we do, that we should be about, is that relationships move at the speed of trust. That might not always be the speed that we want, but with God's guidance, it will lead us to find our way in the world. Thanks be to God.